Hi everyone, today I have another new lens from Korean company Samyang Optics, an autofocus lens for Sony's full-frame mirrorless cameras, the AF 24mm f2.8 FE. Considering that Canon and Nikon may well be working on full-frame mirrorless camera systems themselves right now, Samyang's strategy of designing full-frame mirrorless lenses could be quite prescient. A reminder, as usual, lenses for mirrorless cameras do not work on digital SLR cameras. I'd like to thank Samyang for sending me a review sample of this lens for testing. As usual though, this is a totally independent review. We'll be looking at its strengths and its weaknesses. Now, one of my favourite things in the world that I almost never get to do is wander around Welsh mountainsides and abandoned quarries to explore and see what images I can get, and that's exactly why I love smaller mirrorless cameras with small light camera lenses. So, testing out this tiny 24mm full-frame lens on my Sony a7R II has been a bit of a dream come true for me. I just love tiny camera lenses, and 24mm is a very nice focal length on a full-frame camera. It's a field of view that's on the cusp of being ultra-wide angle. It gives you a lovely wide angle on a full-frame camera with slightly stretched corners for giving your pictures just a hint of drama. But you can still just about get away with subject photography at 24mm, just about. If you're shooting on an APS-C camera, you get a much more normal wide angle here, the equivalent of about 36mm, so much less dramatic but still really useful. The lens's maximum aperture of f2.8 is not especially bright, but it's just about good enough for shooting it indoors or in darker situations. You'll only get out of focus backgrounds though if you get close to your subject. Now, the lens itself is dead simple. It's tiny and made of metal, but it doesn't feel like it's cast out of iron. It's actually very light. Its only control point is a focus ring, which is quite large and turns extremely smoothly. It's electronically coupled to the focus motor, and in manual focus mode, it responded just fine. When shooting still pictures, the autofocus works quickly, with a very quiet but still slightly audible buzzing sound. When shooting in video mode, autofocus slows down a bit. Like I said though, autofocus in stills mode is faster than this. The lens's filter thread size is 49mm, very nice and small for getting inexpensive filters. And the further good news is that you can fit up to 2 filters on there and not see any physical vignetting in your images. Here's the lens with both an ND and a polarizing filter on. However, you may get some natural vignetting just from using a very strong ND filter with a wide-angle lens. That's just the laws of physics. The lens also comes with a very dinky little hood, which looks quite neat, but which is a bit too small to be really effective. Overall, it's a very simple, light, nicely made piece of kit. Let's look at image quality then. Firstly, on a full-frame camera, my Sony a7R II. It has a very demanding 42 megapixel sensor. At f2.8, the lens is just about perfectly sharp in the middle of the image with very good contrast. Over in the corners, we see a fairly clear image, but they are softer, with a hint of chromatic aberration being visible. Stop down to f4 for much more sharpness, and at f5.6, all but the very edges are very sharp. At f8 and f11, sharpness is really impressive, although that blue and orange chromatic aberration is a bit more visible now. At f16, the image begins to get a bit softer due to the effects of diffraction. Overall, on the very challenging 42 megapixel full-frame sensor, the lens is really nice and sharp, although the corners are at their best from about f5.6. That chromatic aberration we saw might be visible in some pictures in the field. Alright, let's see how the lens works on an APS-C camera now, my 24 megapixel Sony a5100. At f2.8, the lens is still really sharp in the middle of the image. The corners are quite soft now though. There's a good improvement at f4, and the image is decently sharp at f5.6. Stop down to f8 for best resolution. although again, some chromatic aberration is visible here. At apertures of f11 or darker, softness from diffraction begins to kick in. So it's a slightly less impressive performance on an APS-C camera, but it's still very sharp in the middle, and stopping the lens down to f5.6 or f8 brings very good results. Well, let's see about distortion and vignetting now on a full-frame camera. When it comes to distortion, we see some noticeable pincushion distortion being projected, nothing too strong though. A compact-sized 24mm lens on a full-frame mirrorless camera, all of that equates to a witch's brew for vignetting, and this Samyang lens shows a lot of vignetting. At f2.8, we see lots of darkness in the image corners. At f4, it's reduced somewhat, but even stopping down to f5.6 or f8, we still see vignetting if you don't use any corrections in editing. There is some good news though. If you turn on in-camera corrections on your Sony camera, then the vignetting is comparatively reduced at f2.8 and pretty much cleared up from f4. This lens can focus as closely as 24 centimeters, so while it won't be mistaken with a macro lens, it can get pretty close to your subject. At f2.8, close-up image quality is slightly softer with some color fringing, but stop down to f4 for a clean, sharp image. Let's see how the lens works now against bright light. It doesn't like them very much. Contrast remains quite solid, which is good, but quite a lot of flaring is visible, so use the lens hood whenever you can. Finally, bokeh. This lens is not exactly intended to get pictures with autofocus backgrounds, but if you're shooting close up, you can get some bokeh going. I think that the quality of those autofocus backgrounds is generally really soft. Well, overall, the Samyang AF 24mm f2.8 FE is a bit of a follow-up lens to their 35mm f2.8 FE. The 35mm lens, which I tested last year, is a really excellent performer and a little bit sharper. But then again, that's what you'd expect, as 24mm is a harder focal length for manufacturers to design and correct optically at a much wider angle. This 24mm lens is really well done though, in my opinion. It's sharp enough for 42 megapixel cameras, especially if you stop down the aperture a bit. It'll be fantastic for video work. Vignetting is high, but that's the laws of physics for you in a lens of this nature. Its flaring is a bit disappointing, but its colours and contrast are good, its distortion acceptable, and its close focus distance, small size and weight makes it really enjoyable to use. I've had a blast using this lens on my hikes around the Welsh mountains. It's great to see a nice, small, full-frame 24mm lens for my lovely Sony camera. It's just my cup of tea, lots of fun, so it definitely comes recommended.